Cool. So welcome everyone officially now to the EU panel of distinguished debaters. We are going to chat for about an hour and a half about relevant issues about the EU, but in the context of lived experiences and in a way that is translated through debaters and that you can use in future debates. We really hope that this would give you a new insight into how to debate big worldly issues, and hopefully it will be interesting and fun. We'll start with a bit of introduction, so I'll just let everyone on the panel introduce themselves. So we'll start with Klaudia.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Klaudia, I'm from Poland and I'm living there since I was born. I'm debating for quite a while, and Poland joined the EU when I was 10, I think. So I remember also the time when there was like some kind of life and some kind of changes. Yeah, in terms of debating, I'm debating way too much in online era. And judging and doing other things as well. I did some major competitions, I did some local ones. Thanks to EU, I visit, I think, 10 or 15 countries only last year. So thank you for, for having Schengen. And I think, yeah, that's, I think, enough information unless you have any questions.
Hi, so Lena.
Hi, my name is Lena. I'm from Germany, and I've studied in Berlin for most of my course. I'm in my master's now in political science. I've also lived in France for a year, thanks to EU funding and the ease of doing Erasmus exchange. I've been debating for a while. I've been really active since 2017 when I got addicted. At the start of it, I was like, oh my God, some people go to world championships. This is so invested. I will never do that. And in the online era, it has especially swallowed my life now. And I just do a lot of it. I have particularly judged in the last year, but I also used to speak more, and I'm also trying to get more back into speaking. But yeah, that's me.
Lucy.
Hello, I'm Lucy from Ireland, and actually, even though Ireland joined way earlier, I'm old enough to remember Ireland getting the euro, so there you go. I'm old enough to remember changes too. I debated for far too long, and am debating for far too long, mainly, well, I would say mainly judge, but I also get roped into speaking quite a lot right now. But I interestingly have never judged the Worlds and very much always just judge Euros, so I'm very much a Europe-based judge at the moment anyway, so hopefully that will be somewhat relevant to this. Yeah, that's me.
Cool. Lovro?
And hello, I'm Lovro. I'm from Croatia, Zagreb, which is where I studied mostly economics, and now I'm trying to finish my management degree. It's going okay, not great, not terrible. But other than that, I lived in Austria and Spain, so I have some experience as well with the Erasmus exchange and with other European exchanges. And that's it. I also mostly judge nowadays, but also speak on an occasion.
Thanks. So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Monica. I will be the moderator for this discussion. I'm from Israel, which is a non-EU country, which will make this very interesting for me as well. So actually, the first question really relates to something that you already mentioned when introducing yourself about the impact of the EU on your life. And you've mentioned Erasmus for one, but I guess I'd like to further the question and then ask, how does the EU manifest in your life or in the experience of other people? Oh, let's do that with the raised hand. Excellent. So Lucy.
I'll go first. I think Ireland being so far west and off the side of England, genuinely didn't get access to people from other countries or cultures for a very, very long time. And even when I started primary school, I suppose for context, I have to age myself. When I started primary school in 1998, there were no non-Irish kids in my school, and I even went to quite a diverse school. So I went to a Jewish school, which isn't the norm, but even there still wasn't really any non-Irish kids. Within 4 years of that, Ireland began to grow massively with EU budget and EU funding and EU interest, and a lot of European people came into Ireland. Specifically now, working in the job market, you see a lot of people in Ireland from like Croatia, Serbia, Poland, a lot of them living in Ireland, possibly because of the Catholic connection, but also the EU connection being the main reason. And it just does mean that the average Irish kid now grows up in a vastly different country to what their parents grew up in, speaking language. Our police force have now had to learn how to read people's rights in Polish. So I think the massive change in our culture is one of opening up and hopefully becoming more inclusive and less skeptic of kind of European countries, which we very much were for a long time. So the EU has massively changed my life in that way, definitely, but I think my country's perception of Europe in a massive way as well. I don't know if other people want to jump in or not.
So I guess feel free to either jump in or raise a hand. So Lovro.
Yeah, so kind of Croatia is still in the stage where we are moving to other countries. So I guess I know a lot of folks who have moved all across the European Union, like even some close friends. I think everyone has someone from the grade, like from school, who's moved somewhere else in search for like better conditions and jobs. But I think also like on a personal level, you mentioned Erasmus. I mean, like, I think that this is one of the most famous things that EU does. So it enables basically everyone who's interested. There's also some sort of like financial scholarships as well. So it's not only reserved for people who are rich, but you can actually afford it more or less in any scenario. So you can go study abroad, you can do an exchange. I think this is really important for students. This is where I have a lot of experience because I'm a student at the moment. But also I think like the way EU has shaped my life up until now, but also hopefully that's gonna go even better once we enter Schengen, is that like you can travel anywhere across EU without any sort of restrictions or visas. And when I talk to my friends in Serbia, this is something which is still problematic for them. So something which is definitely beneficial is that there are no restrictions on travel or working in another country, and that's really great because you have such a big market where you can go and kind of move.
Lena?
I think like from a German perspective, a lot of this has like been just, I think, very normalized. I think both like maybe on a country level for having like been like founding like EU member, and just like having had like a lot of inner European migration to Germany like for a relatively long time. But also for me personally, like I think I very vaguely remember the euro being introduced, but this is like really the only currency I've ever interacted with. I like remember growing up in a context where people were like constantly still comparing it to like the currency we had before. But I think to me, it's just like a lot of the seamlessness that has been introduced to the EU of being like able to travel, being able to go abroad at least for a while. Like, I don't know if I think Germany probably gets more migration than like Germans go abroad, but I think a lot of us like to go abroad for a while, like to travel, like to like spend a year studying somewhere. It has become incredibly normal for students to take at least a semester on Erasmus and just go somewhere. And I think that has introduced a lot more like understanding for other countries and like, yeah, just a greater sense of cultural exchange and somehow like sharing this continent. Yeah.
Klaudia?
So I think that the visible mark, it's a lot of funding in terms of infrastructure, in terms of a lot of building a lot of projects, both educational and economic ones. I think second of all, a lot of like investment and exchange, which makes the Poland a good place for like some kind of foreign investment and some kind of corporations. So that also boosts, and there is a lot of like English speaking companies which hiring people, and it's also quite profitable. I think in terms of my personal experience, there are very good things which I noticed since like travels, because before Poland joined European Union, and also like in the past, since we had very like close ties with Russia and like Eastern Europe, it was like Western Europe is something completely different. It's like different world. It's like rich people, and on our side, it's like more stereotypes point of view. So I think when people start to travel more and see some other places and also development go on, the difference was less visible. But there is also one minus point to this, and this is coming from my work experience. So I was working in restaurants and music clubs, and a lot of people who just wanted to go for like a weekend getaway, they are picking Poland as location because it's very easy to travel in terms of connection, in terms of no visa, Schengen, but also relatively cheap, much cheaper because we don't have a euro. So we have a lot of people who are coming to Poland just go crazy and doing a lot of damage. So a lot of people who are living in like Krakow or like Gdańsk, like bigger cities, just really don't like the tourists. And this is one of the easy connection and lack of border controls thing. And lastly, I think something which is also visible, besides like Erasmus and student things, people going to work in Germany and to the EU countries, they can switch locations in like 3 months, or like very easily access, because they don't need extra documents to cross the border and they can take higher risk. So for example, when you wanted to go to country outside of EU, you probably have harsher controls and other things, which have like a good thing, and also some kind of problems for people who might have bad incentives to some extent. So I think in one hand, we are one step in the EU and very close to the countries on the some level, but also you can feel the notion that EU is connected to money mostly for people, and some of the older generations don't necessarily want to share the value part, like European identity, but only like some of the benefits. So it's very like mixed and depends who you will ask and how like people have experience. I would say that's how in Poland looks like.
So I guess to pick up on that, I would ask, how would you describe then the opinions in your country about the EU and what influences that?
So should I go first now?
Yeah.
Okay. So in theory, people think that Poland is like super anti-union and like super skeptical because we are like doing vetoes and we are like don't like European Union. But like 90% of people, if you ask them, they are happy that they are in European Union. So in general, the perception is very positive. What is negative is the current party or like people in power. When something is problematic, when we have like uprising in terms of ideas, then they are trying to blame European Union for a lot of things. So for example, when they don't want to take refugees, and there's also like some kind of loophole in the budget, they're capable to claim that this is the fault of the European Union and people should be afraid. When there are some regulations on the agriculture or like other groups of people, there is also like European Union's fault. So it's just like a shifting the burden who is responsible. But that's coming from, I think, like more populist political parties and never coming from the people on the ground. So I don't think that if there will be any potential question to make like a exit or even discussion, there will be more than 10% of the people who will be like, oh yeah, we don't like EU, we don't need EU. I think the only problem when people start to be skeptical was introducing the euro in Poland. Because our currency is relatively weak towards euro, and I think this is something which scares people. Other than that, we like EU. Our party didn't like EU, so yeah.
Hey, Lovro?
So the majority of people generally support EU. I think that support is somewhere around like 60-70%. Depending on the time. We're the most recent member as well, so we joined in 2013. So this is what the result was back then for the referendum as well. So I think it's still relatively fresh. And I think that all of the major political parties, except maybe one, which is also kind of like internally split on this idea and not necessarily openly Eurosceptic, also support the European Union. the biggest problem with the European Union or the support was back in like 2000s, when we were supposed to enter the negotiations and open up all of the chapters. And when the chapters were opened, we kind of didn't cooperate with the Hague. So that was a big problem. And that was like, I think you could tell then how much people actually want to join the European Union, because they were willing to extradite a lot of the generals and kind of like military personnel from the war, if this was the condition to enter European Union, right? This was something very difficult for us, blah blah. But also, I think this can be used as, I don't know, examples in debates on what EU can do right and how it can like offer you carrot and a stick if you join. But I think that generally the perception is very positive. We're now introducing the euro as well in 2020 something, hopefully 21 too, but we'll see about this. So even with this, there's not going to be a referendum, because things can happen. If you do a referendum, you might lose it. But I think that all of the major parties can like support it as well. So we are doing the full integration as much as possible right now, and then there's almost no, how you say, skepticism on an institutional level. Of course, you have folks who believe it's a big conspiracy, blah blah, but very much a majority, like minority of the population.
Lucy?
I think Ireland very much so is pro-EU for many reasons. Like prior to joining the EU, we were still considered a third world country on most standards. And with the EU investment in us, we kind of skyrocketed, and then that all crashed lovingly. But we did skyrocket for a while, and it massively changed people's memories. And I think given even within my parents' living memory, Ireland was so Catholic and so isolated and so underdeveloped. The EU has massively changed that, because it has given people, as we kind of were saying earlier, but just on a national level, the chance to actually leave the country. Like, it just wasn't a norm for Irish people to ever be able to leave the country. Maybe they would move to England, but that was about it. On a kind of public level, our newspapers are all very pro-EU. There's very little critique of it in terms of us being part of it and us enjoying it, because I think, as I said, we're aware we got a lot out of it. Unlike Croatia, maybe, Ireland has it in our constitution that we have to have referenda on everything, basically, because we are a republic, and that means something to us, apparently. So whenever anything big happens in the EU, we have to have a referendum on it. And I suppose the closest to skepticism Ireland ever got was the Lisbon Treaty, when we were the one country, well, one of 2 or 3 countries to reject it and say we didn't want to sign it in our referendum. And then what our government did was just give us another referendum on the same question and hoped we would say yes the second time, which we did, because the government made it pretty clear we need to sign this referendum. So that is kind of the one thing where Ireland, I don't think we struggle, but I think we're aware that we need to maintain a check on the EU in some way in order to protect ourselves. That being that a lot of people think Ireland is a tax haven. And we do so in order, like a corporate tax haven, sorry. And we do so because we're a part of the EU, and it means that we can attract international business and get their headquarters here. But it's also our way of, I suppose, our government's way of limiting the power that, say, the more powerful Brussels, like what Brussels has over us, but the more powerful countries in Europe have over us. If we can leverage the fact that we have the European headquarters for like Facebook and Google and things like that, it means that we have some little bit more bargaining control, given our size is so small, which means economically we do kind of have to protect ourselves. And I think that's a result of the 2008 recession. Ireland felt like the EU didn't listen to us at all in terms of what we wanted for our economy and our loans and our solving of our euro crisis. But equally, I think, again, Ireland worries that the EU won't listen to us. And again, we saw that with Brexit. We were afraid that the EU, like we were hoping the EU would back us in terms of the north and south border issue with Brexit. The EU thankfully did back us eventually. It took a little bit more negotiating than maybe we would want, but they did eventually back us. So I think largely the EU has had Ireland's back, possibly because we are one of the few countries that has zero like political EU skepticism. We are very pro the EU. Our former presidents have all then gone on to work for the EU. and kind of integrate ourselves further into it. We do a lot of things like encouraging EU citizens to move to Ireland and things like that. So I suppose the Irish as a whole, it's aware that we got quite lucky, but then also trying to maintain that luck and maintain whatever power we have, especially with Brexit happening and England being in the way now, like literally geographically, but also in the way in terms of we are very politically tied to England. And we are terrified what will happen to our trade. So it's a constant balance, but it's usually one that's done so with the hope that the EU will continue to look after us and we will continue to work with the EU to kind of keep them liking us, I suppose.
Lena?
So I think like Germany also has like very high approval of the EU mostly, and I think like so EU membership was like very non-controversial. If there's like Euroscepticism publicly, then it's more about like reform or specific aspects. So for example, the like AfD started out as a Euro, like anti-Euro party, but like specifically the currency, not the union itself. And like just very strongly arguing that there like needed to be a different system or less integration. And I mean, they continue to do that on the right. And I think this is where you will find like the most anti-EU sentiment in Germany, but there's really no one in politics calling to abolish the EU. And most other political parties and streams are just like very uncontroversially in favor of it. I think most Germans also have a certain awareness that Germany has quite a lot of influence in Europe. And I think there's a like high degree of like also understanding that we like without Europe kind of not be very relevant, but within Europe are quite relevant, and then Europe is relevant. So I think that like there's this perception that kind of German international power to some degree relies on being in Europe, and that this is overall beneficial both on a like diplomatic stage and on just like being important as a country, but also economically being a relatively export-oriented country, just having a like very easy market access. I think all of these things contribute to like this both being good for Germany, but also something that a lot like large part of the population do support. And I think also like for characterizing Germany, maybe in debates, it's like relatively easy to do, I think, from the idea that we have a parliamentary system that is very consensus oriented. And most of the time, all of the German parties kind of stand together, have a very similar opinion. Like the AfD is kind of the outlier that often like goes against whatever the others have as a consensus, especially on the EU. But most of the time, German politicians, like both within Germany, but then also within the EU, try to be very consensus oriented and try to have like broad support for whatever they do and try to be non-controversial. Another piece of like characterization to use there is probably just Germany's history, where Germany also like doesn't want to be controversial on an international stage and doesn't want to like be seen as too much of a hard power. And that I think also feeds into it being like active through the EU and kind of trying to like exert a lot of soft power rather than trying to like put its foot down.
Interesting. So you mentioned, I think all of you, that there is a lot of approval, but also that there are certain issues in which there are concerns or a potential clash between the EU or what your country wants. And I guess my question is then, how interventionist would you say the EU is when it comes to your country and its policies, and how much should it be? So Lena.
So I think not that much. Like I think that's just because Germany is very strong within the EU and like has been also in the past very able to like block some policies. I know like on environmental politics, for example, just because that's like somewhat relevant to my studies, like Germany sometimes blocks like harsher restrictions on the automobile industry, etc., just because it cares for that a lot, and like having a large part of the EU population and a lot of economic power. I don't think that there's that many EU interventionist policies that happen to Germany that Germany would disapprove of. But if there's like policy disapproval, it's more like for things that happen in other countries, where I think German media then also portray often if Germany like pays for something, or like in the Euro crisis specifically, like there was a strong narrative of bailing out Greece and some skepticism there, where like a lot of like parts of the German media and then the population were just very skeptic of that, and we're like, we're footing the bill, we should actually have more control. They're doing something wrong and we're paying for it, which is, I think, also, I guess, a frame to use if you like in a debate want to break the framing of Germany being very soft and consensus oriented, that you like, I think you can analyze that as a sort of tipping point, where if there's a perception that like makes Germany angry, either because they get responsibility or if there's like very negative portrayal of Germany in the foreign media, then I think that's also something that incites a lot of anger within the country, where like most of the time we don't have that much national pride. But for example, also like during the Euro crisis, for example, there was a lot of like Merkel caricatured in a Nazi uniform or something like that. And that would like get very reported in some parts of the German media and like get some of the population angry, as like basically on the idea of we're doing so much and now they're angry at us. Why are they doing that? And I think that can be used as a frame to characterize Germany as a more angry actor. But I think most of the time we're just pro-EU and don't think that they're like stepping on our feet that much.
Klaudia?
So currently in 2020, I think European Union should intervene in Poland a lot. I think there are some issues, which is just problem with the judiciary system, problem with women's rights and in like LGBT community rights. And it's really hard to do something when like the ruling party have the majority, and it's really hard to outvote them in the meantime. So I think like cutting funding is like a good strategy. I think we already saw the intervention from European Union when they canceled the budget for one of the part of Poland for anti-LGBT zones. But unfortunately, our government gave them the same amount of money to like equalize this. So I think as long as that's just like a simple actions, like one time, it doesn't necessarily hurt that much people and didn't necessarily put the emphasis how bad some of the actions are. So I think definitely in terms of Polish context and in terms of what's happened now, there should be some more pushback. Something also which happened during the abortion protests and like a lot of letters about the violence which happened and the treatment of some political leaders. I think other than that, people are usually mostly scared by the disinformation which happen in the media in Poland. So our national TV station, it's very, very much pro the ruling party. So every information, if you read that in like foreign media company, like as a debaters, if you research, you find like 10 sources and the notion is very similar. They are capable to shape this and present in the worst possible EU light. And for people who didn't use the internet and who didn't do research by themselves, that's the only source of knowledge. So that's the people who are more skeptical and like don't want EU involvement. So just wanted to take European Union money. But other than that, I think currently people are just very, very frustrated, and any potential reaction, probably I'm speaking for myself, but stronger reaction will be necessarily. In terms of times when there is like probably less extreme party, I would say we'll still need some kind of intervention in terms of environmental policy, in terms of going into green energy, to just try to combat the other mindset and some kind of also poor disadvantaged perspective, which some people have, that they just want to keep whatever benefits they got now compared to like past times, like 20 or 30 years ago. So yeah, I think that will be like overview of this.
Lucy?
I think in terms of, well, first I'll kind of piggyback off what Klaudia said. When Ireland had our referendum for choice or abortion rights, whichever way you want to phrase it, it happened very, very quickly. Obviously not quickly in terms of people had been fighting for it for a very long time, but it happened very quickly insofar as when I started university, it was still massively taboo to even bring up that you were on the side of wanting to change these laws. It was still quite, it felt like an unwinnable fight. Like me and my friends used to say things like, well, maybe we'll get rights for our daughters, but we probably won't get rights for ourselves, sort of thing. Within 3 or 4 years, though, there was a lot of pressure from the EU and a lot of pressure from like the European Court of Human Rights for us to change our laws, in particular because Ireland was one of the few countries, I suppose, that tried to pretend we were part of like the cool kids club of like, we're the modern ones who've been in the EU for ages, because we did join back when like the UK joined. And the EU eventually started saying, well, then you need to change your laws and you need to update yourselves. So in terms of that sort of pressure, I agree with Klaudia, probably should have been a slightly more severe pressure, but there still was a little bit there, which was nice. I also felt support from the EU, maybe on a less political level, but on a kind of EU community level. I was in Germany the week before the Irish referendum, and when I was flying home to vote, there were people standing outside the airport trying to help Irish women get on flights and trying to make sure that we could get home to vote. So that was really, really impressive. 2 flights got cancelled because there was a storm, and lots of German people gave up their flights for us to be able to fly home. So that was quite nice on a community level. In terms of more wider political intervention and policy intervention, I think the Irish were really annoyed with the common fisheries policy and the common agricultural policy because they are the 2 things we do. We are an island who has a lot of fish, and we have historically just been farmers. So when the EU, and I suppose for a debate, you kind of say that the EU, for you to receive its benefits, very often tries to minimize the uniqueness of your economy insofar, unless you're one of the bigger players, because it wants to kind of protect itself from either you developing too much and then not needing them as much. Well, this was the way we felt, or they don't want you to do something stupid and have like, what was it? Like, what's the opposite of shortages? Stacking of food that goes off. I can't think of the word for it. The reserves of food were too high in some countries. But anyway, so the common fishery policy and the common agricultural policy, Ireland really wasn't happy with. The one thing we were able to do was use that as leverage, I suppose, and say, well, if we're signing this, then you have to let us have some more money. And that's kind of what we did. But I think in terms of intervention, as I said earlier, like the EU kind of comes up with an idea and we feel like we have to follow it regardless. So when we didn't agree to the Lisbon Treaty, eventually we had to agree to the Lisbon Treaty, because I suppose the EU is powerful enough to kind of say, well, we're doing this and you can either do it with us or not get the money off of us. And as a smaller country, that largely becomes the way they deal with it. And I agree with Klaudia, they should probably do the inverse a little bit more and say, well, if you like our money so much, you should be changing your policies as well. But they're doing it in some level. I think with Ireland, it was easier for them to do than it is for Poland, but hopefully in a few years, they'll be able to do it with Poland as well.
Lovro?
Yeah, so I mean, I have some areas where I want EU to be more interventionist, some where I want EU to be less interventionist. So where I want the EU to kind of be more interventionist is the common market. So I know these include recently things being done such as that you don't have data roaming if you travel the EU, right? Which I think the next step is to allow like for plans that are going to actually cover everywhere you go in EU for like data or like your mobile phone service and all of this. I think this is a good idea. If we travel everywhere, then we should have the mobile phone coverage also as well. So similarly with the bank union, I think there's a lot to be done here to actually integrate and allow banks from different countries to operate in different countries, because right now this is still largely under national authorities and it's very hard for you to operate from one country to another country. I think ideally you should be able to do so. And probably I also want EU to kind of like, I mean, this is a very far push, but I want EU to regulate some of the outliers in terms of the tax policy and something like this. So yeah, Ireland definitely. I mean, it's very good for Ireland. I'm not sure if it's very good for the rest of EU if we have such different tax rates. This is just an example with corporate tax, but also with other stuff. I think there should be some sort of mechanism for EU to balance these differences. And where I want EU to be less interventionist is probably the common agriculture policy. So definitely I would not subsidize that much agriculture. I think it's a waste of money, harms the developing world because they can't produce sugar cane there and all of this. And also bureaucracy. Like I would cut all bureaucracy in EU. I would fire 30% of people who are working in Brussels, make all of the things online. You wouldn't have to like fill 10,000s of papers to apply for something. I would cut this. And probably maybe I would make a little bit less EU, like environmentally friendly. So I would still be the global leader, meaning I would be better than USA and all of these other countries, I know Canada, Australia, but I would not be so harsh on green technology and all this because I don't think it's necessarily profitable at this thing, and we suck at econ. I assume we're going to talk about this later, but I think this is the biggest problem. EU is not competitive.
So I see we have a question from the audience. I think we will leave room in the end for questions for everyone who is listening. I want to pick up on the thing about bureaucracy in which you mentioned, and at least from the outside, it's seen as if the EU is quite remote. It's this body of bureaucrats that hovers over everyone. And I guess my question is, from actually living in the EU, how much do you feel like you have an influence, or how much is it a body of actually the people, or what's then the relationship between people on the ground and the EU? Lovro.
I don't want to get too much into the explaining mode here, but just very briefly. So, for example, what happened in the last election? So there was the EU elections, and all of the countries vote for members of parliament, and then you get a European Parliament every 5 years. And then from each of the big groupations, so you have the left, you have the right, and then you have the right, and the left. But mostly it's the left and right who are in coalition. When whoever wins more votes, they form an EU government. At this time, I think they are also with the liberals because they didn't have votes. They kind of their percentage shrunk. So what they did before is they made this system of Spitzenkandidaten, let's say. So parties would say, there's one person in our party who, if we win the election and if we are going to vote, they're going to be the chief commissioner, the boss of EU government. And what happened in the last election is this went totally to hell, right? Because they couldn't make a deal with the countries, so they couldn't get the countries backing for the commission as it was supposed to be. And then there was some literally like backroom meetings where I think it was Manfred Weber who was supposed to be like the leader, and then we got to Ursula, which is okay, but like this wasn't the people's choice, and people didn't know that they were supposed to be the president of the commission and all this. So basically, you vote for the election. European Parliament is the only thing that you vote for, and then the commission is basically formed in a totally different way, right? Like each country proposes one member. So, you know, when Nigel Farage talks about the unelected, non-democratic body, I think he's in part full of BS, but in part he's also right, because the elections where you choose your leaders do not necessarily then transcend to the government that you're going to get of EU, and I think this is problematic.
Lena?
Yeah, I think like there's like also just on the perception level, I don't think there's a strong perception of democracy in the EU. Like even where we do get to vote, I think like the just percentage of people who actually like the turnout is very low for European elections, because most people, at least like in Germany, don't perceive it as something that actually matters. Or the European Parliament as something that has like a lot of power. I think a lot more, and it's like seems to be decided where it's decided either by the country heads and just the like national governments coming together, or by bureaucrats that, as like Lovro described, especially now, there's not that much influence over who that actually is. And I think it's also like one of the bigger challenges of the EU going forward, that there's this like ongoing problem of how to even solve that, which I think even on an intellectual level is quite difficult to think of, because you still have to deal with countries that are quite different in like their cultures and the media they have access to, in how they thus perceive themselves and perceive the problem. But also in the like relative power that the EU has, I think there's like a big problem of just having like very, very different population sizes, and then kind of a problem that also like just happens with every federal state, where you have to somehow balance between like countries that have like less than 5 million people and then other countries that have more than 60 million people, and not wanting to give them like that much more power, but also making it like hard to not have them be more powerful and then just being able to steamroll other countries. I mean, the EU has a lot of bureaucratic measures of how many countries and how many percentages of the population represented by these countries have to vote in something. But I think all of that like makes it very hard for people on the ground to feel that they're actually represented by this body at all.
Lucy?
As I said earlier, Ireland loves a referendum. So we do actually have a lot of votes when it comes to the EU. So I think there is more maybe of a feeling of us actually making decisions when it comes to the EU. Whether or not those decisions actually translate to things happening is another thing, but we do feel like we are connected, I suppose, to who our EU leaders are. They do get challenged a lot. It has happened before where maybe our EU minister has had to step down for whatever reason, and instead of the government just picking a new one, there was a by-election for that person. So we do always, our constitution is very specific on what we have to vote for, and that is something I suppose us being a smaller country we are able to do. In terms of our feeling of do we have control over it and is it a bureaucracy, without going into too much about like what I want to change about the EU, because I assume we'll talk about that a bit more later, it seems very much like the actual workings of the EU is more who you can convince and what you're willing to give up in order to get what you want, rather than there being a fairness in terms of what helps the most countries or what is best for the EU as a whole. I think countries are still in it for what is best for them, and the only concessions people make is to gain something else for them, which if you want to use that in a debate context, I think it's not as clear and cut as X country will never agree to Y policy, which very often people say like Ireland will never agree to a non-Catholic policy or whatever. It's more a case of what is someone willing to give up in order to achieve what they want, but equally how good is your politician at convincing people. It was a scandal internationally, but the Irish population were quite proud of it, that our MEP just got all of the other MEPs drunk on Guinness and Hennessy, and then the next morning they all agreed to what that minister wanted. And it's funny, but then it's also terrible in terms of like, it was good for Ireland, but probably bad for the populations of those countries that their MEP was based. It seems though decisions are very often made on who you're friends with or what you're willing to give up, rather than what's actually good for the EU as a bloc, which maybe does come into improving the European identity thing and the interconnectivity of European countries, so that you're willing to maybe give up something so that, say, Poland can prosper or insert whatever country can prosper. But I don't think the EU is at that stage yet. It's still very fighting for yourself and fighting for your own country.
Klaudia?
So I think Poland recently, the perception of EU is mostly about money, and they're like trying to find the block of the country, which it's obviously like Hungary in terms of we will not allow this like Western ideas like pumping the money in the something which we are not ready yet, when we don't have infrastructure, like we wanted to do our own methods, which is problematic in the EU sometimes, the unanimous decision process, because then it gave some countries the leverage. In the other hand, this leverage is sometimes important in terms of the size of the country, in terms of the power which exists. And I think this is something which is tried to be weaponized against currently. I think second of all, people didn't treat, I think, European institutions with that much respect, especially some people, because our political discourse, it's a bit ridiculous nowadays. So when people like Korwin-Mikke making these statements in the European Parliament, in the front of the audience, and people are seeing or like listening what he's saying, people trying to be like less engaged with all of this process, because they just don't feel that they have any control on like who is there or like what kind of decision are made. and we are not making referenda as a nation. So a lot of decisions are taken on the top, and especially when there is majority people in the parliament from one party, there's like lack of diversity to trying to push the new ideas. So I don't think that we have a feeling of power or like perception of democracy working well. But again, I need to emphasize that this is not, I think, problem from the side of the EU, but this is internal problem on the issues which we have as Poland currently. So yeah.
Thanks. So next question would be, I guess, on a bit of a broader scale, what would you say is the largest challenge the EU is facing at the moment? And you can address COVID and you can address other things if you feel that they are relevant. So Lucy.
I think to address COVID through what I already thought was the biggest issue prior to COVID, which is COVID has made it even harder to be interconnected as countries and to not be selfish as countries. Because obviously you need to protect your own citizens, but also you can't travel or are afraid of travel or afraid of engaging. Meaning that I think one of the biggest problems the EU faces is people's willingness to give up something for other people or to actually fully invest in creating a European identity. And I think that is what stems into all of the other flaws of the EU, because if the problem is we can't agree on a common economic policy, I think it's because people are still being rather selfish over their own states. And if we can't agree on what level of sovereignty we're all willing to give up for the EU to prosper, then we can't actually achieve any of the policies that maybe would solve the EU or would develop the EU. I think certain countries are more willing to give up things, but largely I think those countries that are willing to give up things are those countries that have already benefited, because they feel powerful within the EU altogether. I think one of the biggest things we managed very badly as a union was the integration of the 2002 and 2007 members, i.e. the majority of Eastern Europe, because we promised a lot and then didn't really give a lot. Or we pretended we gave a lot by saying you can come work in Western Europe without actually kind of helping those countries feel like they were part of Europe and not just maybe a workforce for Europe. And as an Irish person who's, as a country, can kind of see both sides, can see the very privileged side, but can also see the side of having been fucked over by kind of the powerful people within Europe. I think EU handles it very badly by just calling people populist or nationalist or angry and not actually engaging with the problems. Some of the news that comes out of Brussels is not very good in terms of how they engage with critique. They just kind of say, well, if you want your money, shut up or leave. Please don't leave, but also just shut up. And I think the EU doesn't know how to handle critique, I suppose, as a whole.
Lovro?
Yeah, so I think the biggest problem is econ. This is only getting worse with the COVID and a lot of European countries being lockdown enthusiasts, especially like, I don't know, countries like Scotland or else, which I think are also in some cases, in a lot of cases, in unnecessary lockdowns even. So I'm not like a corona pandemic and all of this, but I do think that there's very little evidence provide they should be acting like they are, and this is only going to screw up the economy. And I realize that EU has limited ability to influence countries' economy because, I don't know, like the collective budget of EU is only 1 or 2% of the GDP of EU. But the biggest problem is the economy and the sluggish growth literally everywhere. I think this is going to get worse now that Britain has left. Because you at least had some sort of scale going on before. So with Britain, Netherlands, and Ireland, you had pro-market liberal policies, and then you had kind of like the more continental approach, France and Germany, which were kind of like in the middle, and then you had the South, which was in, I don't know, state intervention and do all sort of these things. Probably also a little bit of the communist heritage in Eastern Europe. Now I think the scale has tilted, and I'm afraid that there's no more economic growth in EU, especially in countries like Italy or, I don't know, France, which are very, very sluggish. So this is the first thing. I think this should be a priority for EU. I think EU puts a lot of emphasis on, I don't know, the digital revolution or the green environment policies, and that this is somehow going to increase growth, which I think is true and could be done. But also I think that they need to cut government, they need to cut government spending, they need to relax the market, the labor market, and actually like cut a lot of the regulation, even in the financial sphere, because otherwise like you're just not going to have growth. And then I think this is the reason for all of the other things, in terms of that there's a fight over distribution. You cannot distribute something and give people more when they need to if there's no something to distribute. And this is, I think, a lot of populist movements actually come from this, and they are driven by this. So this would be the biggest problem that I see right now.
Lena?
I don't know if I have like that much to add, but I think to tie into like some things that Lucy has said, and just like I think a lot of EU countries and COVID has shown that are like more willing to like do something if they've profited, and also if they're like, it's still kind of a us first approach. Like I think Germany often is, as a country, like very willing to like try to give and like try to look good. I think Germany is like in that very concerned with having kind of a good image. But I think COVID has also shown that as soon as there's like a threat to the country itself, it's just first dealing with it domestically, first like dealing with the own economic problems, like locking borders, which I just found unimaginable prior to that then like just in the mainstream politics was like, yeah, we just have to like kind of kill the Schengen zone temporarily, which just like seemed like a really huge deal. Having grown up here, like having grown up with seamless borders, that's like was big. But also I think in the like early days of COVID, when it was like that much of a crisis that nobody really knew how to deal with, there was so little going on in Europe, and all countries were like dealing with themselves first. And I think now, for example, Germany is like coming out a bit more and like talking about like COVID aid for other European countries, but I think that only happens after they've dealt with it, or like after we've dealt with it ourselves and are like in a somewhat good position. And I think that just like is a problem in the long term if we like can't stay together in like the worst of a crisis, and countries are only willing to give something as soon as it like doesn't really hurt themselves, and as soon as they've like dealt with their own problems.
Klaudia?
I think adding to what was already said, it's the transition period. So I think the times when EU was prosper like very well, when there was like a lot of countries spending to join, like there was not that much issues, there was just like a waiting when they will be ready. The erasing issues are just making situation more complicated, because with if you want money now, there need to be more restrictions, or there need to be some kind of cost, which it's a bit harder for countries to get into. But second of all, and I think most importantly, there is the narrative fight, which is something which Lucy mentioned when she started speaking, in terms of leaders using a lot of like hatred language and fighting for their own interest, in which when you are trying to get some kind of money, more like EU stance, it's going from some countries for also like moral and some kind of sustainable part. On the other side, it's like our countries should go first and we don't want to get like more damage. So I think the ability to control the discourse and to not let people criticize too much without like defending the position, it's something which is connected to both of the issues which I mentioned. And I think that's what will be the challenge. Additionally, but I think that's more of the like Polish or like poorer countries issue, healthcare system after COVID. So a few years ago, there's like a very famous quote now, which was on the first page of newspaper. If our doctors want to go to Germany, let them go. Like when people are massively migrate because they don't want to increase the payment for doctors. And now we just don't have people who are skilled to work in country. So I think post-COVID, if there will be any second wave of pandemic, or if we will like not get vaccine very soon, there will be extremely hard to get the healthcare systems in some countries to back on track. So I think that will be the additional challenge, which is really hard to sort, because you can't relocate people, or like you can't force them. It's really hard to see how you will locate them, or like even if you fund some kind of equipment, you need people to use this, or like you just need capacity. So I'm not sure how much this will be like connected to EU as institution, but I think to some kind of spending or like stimulation or some kind of rules or any potential help, that will be the challenge which a lot of countries, especially on the eastern part of Europe, will be struggling in like a year or like even sooner to some extent.
So something really interesting that I think Lucy and Lena mentioned, and Klaudia as well, is on the identity front and the interest and how do people view themselves versus viewing them as being a part of the EU. And I wanted to ask, do you think there is such a thing as European identity? And if yes, what does that mean? And if no, could there be one? Lucy.
I think even prior to the EU, there was a European, I suppose, maybe exceptionalism identity, where obviously Europe being the start of the world, according to most people, but the fact that I suppose Europe as a whole owned a lot of the world, there was an exceptionalism ideology, and I think that might still be carrying through insofar as we don't need to solve some of our problems because as a whole, as a European whole, we're like capable of always kind of bouncing back, and we don't think about changing as quickly as maybe other blocks or regions or countries might do. In terms of like an actual on the ground identity, I think there's definitely multiple. But the funny thing is, if you kind of step back and look, I think that a lot of European citizens, especially given the EU, do have quite similar lives, right? Like it has now become the case where a younger generation can expect to go to university, can expect to be able to get cheap flights and travel, can expect to be able to form a middle class or achieve being part of that middle class. And that does have identity, like that does impact on one's identity. But I think, again, the EU struggles to make that a reality in people's minds, to make them cognizant of the fact that that is part of their identity. Because I think people too quickly get used to the new things in their life and don't realize where that has come from or where that element of them comes from. In the same way, like people might say, oh, I'm not religious, but I just have morals. They don't realize that those morals stem from the religion of their country. I think the EU as a whole does have that. It's just really bad at recognizing that it's from the EU and not just that we all magically got a pot of money from somewhere and all became wealthy and all became, we're not wealthy, but comfortable. So yeah. Then as well, then you got the two separate identities. You got like the leaders and then the not leaders, and the not leaders tend to be the more fun countries. But possibly that's just historical oppressed identity versus historical oppressor identity. But yeah, largely that's my thoughts on identity, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Lena.
So I think there's definitely a European identity. I also agree with the notion that it's probably multiple, and I think it's probably very informed by like your national context and where you come from. So I don't think a lot of Germans identify with a European level. But I do think that it is like kind of a very like German brand of having that European identity that is like still informed from just being raised in a certain country, growing up with the media of a certain country, being informed on your like idea of what this means by probably consuming still like a limited amount of narratives in media. I also think like it's like for me relatively easy to have these multiple identities because like we're a very federal country and we have a lot of regional identities as well, and a lot of people also very strongly identify with the region that they're from. So like Bavarians very strongly are like Bavarians, sometimes even more than they identify as Germans. And you also have that for many other regions or like cities where people just have that very strongly, and then it's almost like just instead of having like 2 levels, maybe having 3 levels of identity there that they identify with. And I think they're coming back to like on the German level of like having relatively low national pride. I think a lot of Germans also prefer to identify with like regional levels or like European identity as at least as labels that they take on. But like thinking about it, I find it very hard to actually explain what like the label of being a European means and what exactly that entails, beyond like kind of having this just very broad idea of like very broad belonging to a continent, and like maybe some degree of investment to the European Union that comes with that, of just like feeling some sense of like, I don't know, national pride for it at the point at which you identify with Europe.
Klaudia?
So I think there is like a hybrid of identities which exist in Europe from my perspective, at least. And it's really hard to emphasize what is the European identity, because it's also like similar to other types of influence which might change your like ideology, like how you perceive yourself. I think the European identity showed up in the words when it's going against some other identities. So for example, when the European values are different than the some older Catholic values which exist in some parts of the places, like or like when it's perceived as too progressive. So I think in my country, at least, when you heard European values, that means you are probably too progressive, or you are probably going far beyond and something which is not yet reachable here. Other than that, I don't think that people are using this term at all. And especially for people who are like more conservative, who are like from more rural areas, who didn't have that much exposure to the Western values, or like to the things which are quite new, quite fresh in the country. So to sum up this, I just don't think that European identity exists neither strongly in Poland, or neither is perceived positively by the political discourse, especially by going into the contradiction to some of the other values in which like some groups in the society or some like positions of power are built around.
Lovro?
Yeah, so I think that at the moment there is still a little bit of European identity, but if you continue with this much immigration, this is gonna go away.
Oh, what do you mean?
I'm just kidding. I mean, like, well, there is some truth, maybe, to hear with all the, let's say, dangers that we have, and with the lack of agreement that we can come up with the EU. And this was, I think, one of the biggest crises recently. I think that, I don't know, I can tell you first about me a little bit personally. So I've lived in Austria, I live in Madrid, and I really feel like that everywhere I go in EU, also when I used to go in the previous life, to real life tournaments, no online, I really felt at home. And I don't know, I felt different to when I would travel outside of the EU. I don't know, that there was always this feeling that things were a little bit similar, and that there was like things that I recognize, whether it was EU flags on buildings that I know that EU finance, or just in the way things are done and all of this. So I think this is something which is, or in terms of culture and food and all of this, although it's very different, but still there's this common denominator everywhere you travel. And I think this is a part of the European identity. But also I think there's a difference between European identity versus EU identity, right? Because I don't know, probably my grandparents also share some sort of common European identity, something along the lines which Lucy talked about, but also potentially, I know, they lived in the times of the Cold War, so they maybe share some sort of identity with also people who lived in Eastern Europe in the Cold War, in terms of similar stuff or how they lived and all this. But the newer generations, I think, specifically have this EU identity, where you know about EU institutions, you know about elections, you know about things that the EU is doing in your country. You've probably met a lot of people from EU inside of your life. I think that on the basis, chances are that people who are going to be seeing these are debaters, right? So they're like very active in like these like squishy NGO things, blah, blah, blah. And I think that for most of them, this is what EU funds, and you've had the opportunity to actually go into one of these and then meet people from all across Europe. So this is the type of EU identity that you're like, that everyone is intermixed. There's a lot of exchange, and that all of you are big friends and, you know, like very happy and dancing in a circle. I think this is what EU wants to achieve, and in some part it is successful in achieving this. But also inside of EU, I think that there are regional identities. So like the Mediterranean identity, or the North Sea identity. Scandinavia, I think, has its own identity and the way in which they do things. Similar to maybe to Ireland before, when it was Britain and Ireland, they also have their own identity, which is different maybe to continental, the German one, or the, I don't know, Czech one, and all this. So I think that there's a lot of sub-identities in the European identity, which are also important for people. And I think at the end, at this point, we're at the level where if you ask someone from the United States, they're going to tell you that they're first American and then from Tennessee. And similarly, I think if you ask someone from China, they're first going to tell you they're from China and then from, I don't know, Hong Kong or Shenzhen, or I don't know, something maybe less controversial if you talk about Hong Kong. But I think if you ask someone from Europe, they're going to first tell you I'm from France or I'm from Portugal, and then they're going to tell you, but I'm also from EU, right? So I think that the level to which this is important is probably less, considering the national identities, which are still predominant, I think.
So speaking of the local, if you could tell debaters one major thing about your country that you think that they don't get correctly, or that you would like them to fix in debating, what would that be? So, Lovro.
I don't know, actually. I don't, I can't, like, I was thinking about this also, but I can't pinpoint one thing that people get wrong about Croatia. There's either like multiple things that people get wrong about Croatia, but they're also not something which are, I would say, overarching in terms of that they're particularly bad stereotype or importance. Sometimes people from, I mean, outside think that we are Russians. So then I think this is the, we're close to Russians, let's say, in terms of language, but not even that. We're much closer to, I don't know, Czechs or Slovenians or Serbians for that matter, than we have a very similar language. So I don't know. I think actually that people don't recognize the differences between Slavic identities or Slavic languages, and how actually different we all are and how we share different histories. So this is potentially one thing that I would talk to people. So just say to people, just in the same way that you would recognize that Italy and France are very much different to each other, although they also kind of like share similar culture or similar languages. In the same way, I think that all of the Slavic little countries are also different, although we do share some like meme pages and general things that we do similarly.
Klaudia.
So I don't think that, so there's the one thing which I think was very hilarious, which I heard in the debating, and that was in the Asian tournament. So I was very curious of actually two things. So one was an Asian competition, and I was very curious how people came to this conclusion. So apparently there is a perception in some places that if Poland will not accept 5G technology, then we will leave the European Union, because 5G technology is in the law and justice interest. And I asked the team after the round, like, how they came to this conclusion, and they just assert this because they know that Poland is Eurosceptical like Hungary. So people usually just put Poland and Hungary, it's like Kaczynski Orban, to the same bag and like present as an example. So I think they require a little bit more analysis, because there are a lot of differences in the approach, even if the outcome is quite similar. So if someone will see me in the panel, I would not recommend to try to pick Poland as example without analyzing, because it's easy to get the mistake. But I think second thing, and that was also quite funny, that at Swedish competition, someone said that law and justice came to power because we accept too many refugees, which is like reverse order of the events. And that's also interesting statement for someone. It's hard to see how this is follow. But I think the reason for this is we are showing up in the headlines and as in examples in the European press, but there is not much analysis because we are not that influential player in terms of decision-making process, but we are very vocal in terms of bad stuff which we are doing, or at least problematic stuff. So I would say this. Other than that, some of the stereotypes of us speaking Russian or being very, very close connected to the Russian culture and history, which I don't think that there are that many similarities with any of the like Eastern world countries at this point. I think we are quite divided. But yeah, that will be the brief overview.
Anna?
So, like, I don't know if I've found like super like specific examples that constantly happen. What I've seen a lot recently is like people kind of like trying to over-represent the importance of political changes and being like, and the AfD is going to become this powerful, or like Merkel stepping down is going to like lead to huge changes. And I just think that like neither of those are actually all that impactful if you want to analyze Germany as a country in debates. Like, I think like, yeah, Merkel is stepping down and she's been the chancellor for 15 years now. And that is like a big deal in terms of having been in power, but just she isn't a very proactive politician. She's extremely reactive, extremely calm. And I think the main change is going to be that you lose this like person who has a lot of like, I don't know, enigma and like history to her of just having been around very long and being respected for that. But you're probably going to end up with someone from her very same party, and the new government is probably going to be led by like, most likely, like they are by far the leaders in the polls that's going to like stay the same party for the foreseeable future, and their partner is going to stay the same, or maybe they're going to be replaced with the Green Party, which would like not change that much about the policy they have. So I think just like analyzing the German government going forward, it's kind of just like more of the same, more of this consensus orientation and a lot of similar policies. And similar like with the AfD, I think if like people want to make their kind of right-wing populism arguments and apply them to Germany, I think you have to like, at least to make it plausible to me, like if I'm judging you and you want to make it plausible, then go like kind of in smaller steps and on a smaller scale, because I think the main impact of the AfD is the political scare and the media impact it has, rather than any like real political impact, because they like very consistently poll at around, I think 10%, which is like even slightly less than what they have in parliament right now. So they are probably there to stay, but they're like in parliament mostly just annoying and nobody works with them. And I don't think this is changing in the political, like in the foreseeable future. And I think if you like want to analyze an impact from them existing on German mainstream politics, then it's more through them having a lot of media impact or like inciting demonstrations in their supporters, and that like scaring more mainstream center-right politicians into trying to move right in order to get them back. Like one of the candidates in the running to replace Merkel as like head of the Christian Democrats is like kind of a supporter of this let's try to go fishing for the right-wing voters narrative. So that's like maybe something to watch for in January, when they hopefully finally manage to do that, because they've like literally since before COVID happened failed to elect a new leader because the pandemic. So like the biggest change that's actually likely there is that maybe they get someone who buys into the idea of getting back some right-wing voters, but mostly German politics are like still relatively stable, and the AfD is more of a media thing than an actual political party. And maybe that can help making a bit more like nuanced arguments about German politics going forward.
Lucy?
Two things. First, to just debaters in general. Iona is not the UK, so please stop saying that. You will get screamed at by me and any Irish person if you do that. But also, like, there's a reason debating came up with islands of the North Atlantic, because Irish people are not happy with any other alternative. Okay, but actual things for debates are just ideas. Separating the identity of Irish people is a lot more nuanced than a lot of people actually say. I think people kind of go, they were either Catholic and hated the English, or they were like people who loved the English. I think most people in my generation had like one granddad who fought for England because he had to, and one granddad who was in the IRA because he kind of had to. And our identity is a lot more complicated than people want to portray us as. Equally, if I hear one more person just make jokes about the IRA in a debate without understanding that it is an organization, it's separate organizations that have developed massively. So it started as a citizens army to try and gain back our country, and then became a terrorist organization over a long time. When it became a terrorist organization is also up for debate. Like, some Irish people think it has never become a terrorist organization. Some people think it did in the 80s. Some people think it did in the 90s. Most people agree it wasn't one up until the 60s, that it was just our government, because they became our government. Look up who the UVF are. I'm not going to go into it, but there was terrorists on the other side too who killed lots of people. So please look into that. There were Protestant terrorists too. Although I'm probably being a hypocrite if I'm calling them terrorists and not the IRA, but like, meh. And the last thing is the Republic and the South are also different things. There are counties in the northern part of Ireland that are part of the Republic. So I think simplifying things down to, we hate the English, we are terrorists, and we have a very Catholic identity is what a lot of debaters do. In particular, if any English debaters are watching this stream, the north of Ireland is part of your country, so you should probably know some of its history in terms of talking about it in debates. But I won't go into that. There's lots of rants of me talking about this on the internet if you do want to look at them.
Fair enough. So I guess going back to the EU. So we've spoken about bad things, we've spoken about good things, and the next question is then, overall, is the EU a success, and why? Oh, Lovro.
So I think EU is definitely a success. Like, it's better than the alternative, I think, because we are, I think, have much more interconnectedness in the European continent with this. I think there's prospect of other countries joining as well. I think we collectively have a lot more strength in international relations than we do like alone. I think even the economic relations are bettered by the EU, and the trade agreements. I mean, like, the whole EU is a common market, so this is something which is important, but also EU kind of, like, because of this, wants to champion free trade all across the globe. So I think this is good. I mean, of course, there are problems, but I think that overall, if you put it on balance, I think it's an overall success. And something which potentially is not that much talked about recently. And I'm not sure if we can only credit EU for this, but I think that there's a good argument to be made that the stability brought upon by EU has actually led to a large amount of conflicts or potential conflicts inside Europe between different countries, kind of either dying out or at least be put on hold for some period. So there's a stabilization, I think, effect of EU that is also very nice. So overall, very good.
Klaudia.
I think definitely positive. It's really hard to see some of the countries developing by themselves and getting that uplift, or like doing projects like business without getting some kind of information or like prior knowledge or experience in the field. So I think on that ground, there's like hard to see better option. I think in terms of development of the ideas, there's also a very huge improvement when people get exposure to other nations, to other ideas, to other problems, and getting some more discussion and listen to this. So I think when this is coming with the very important addition, which is like manual, where it's like a lot of political process and information, when this is not only like telling you some story without any impact or influence. That's why EU, I think, was successful, especially in the places where there was slower development based on the history and based on the previous events. So I think there are a lot of flaws, but it's really hard to see, I think as Lovro said, the alternative, or like what will happen regardless. So yeah, as the institution and as the idea, definitely more pros than cons.
Lena?
Yeah, I think I largely agree, and with like over the last hour or so of conversation, I think we've had a lot of positive examples of what the EU can do, and I think the EU at its best and when it works is just a great thing to have, and at the very least, I think has really fostered more of a connection and understanding for each other just by making it so much easier to engage with each other, and so much more common for people to travel abroad, to live abroad for a while, to migrate between countries, and that then just also getting people on the ground into contact with each other, and which I think is just very important also on a continent where the EU did come out of 2 world wars and trying to unite these countries together more, that had a lot of animosity. And I do think that at least one very real impact of the EU is lessening that to some extent by giving people a common project and just bringing them into contact with each other.
Lucy?
I think, as they've all said, as a concept, yes, it's been a success. I think as an institution, it's probably no longer a success in terms of the level of bureaucracy there is, the fact that it's not able to achieve change. Obviously, that depends how you define success. Obviously, it's a success in keeping basic things functioning and ticking over. But I think in terms of being an institution that could achieve the things that an institution of its size ought to be achieving, it is failing. It is failing to address populism. It is failing to solve economic problems that other like that ASEAN seems to be able to solve, but the EU can't for some reason agree on or solve. And that might just be because we have a lot of very small countries, and maybe this is the best we can hope for, and we will never be able to get past that. So as an idea, yes. As an institution, like a functioning institution, it's, I think, failing to be what it ought to be or should be or could be.
So that actually leads me to the last question on my side, and we'll start with you, Lucy. What do you wish the EU?
I wish the EU could probably move out of Brussels and maybe have a rotationary, something rotationary that made countries feel like they actually had a say in it, so that it wasn't just all of the countries against Germany and France, which it does very much seem. And Ireland probably gets lumped in there a lot as well, actually. We're kind of shitty to the EU, to smaller countries in the EU as well. Yeah, I wish they could find a mechanism to make smaller countries feel like they had a say. I think maybe having a rotationary council or a rotationary panel might be the way to look into of doing that, similar to the UN, but also the UN is broken, so maybe that's wrong. And I wish that the EU would realize that the way we used to do things is no longer the way we need to do things. I think wars aren't the wars, and basic taking people out of abject poverty is no longer the goal of the EU. Most European countries are past that. And it is now about addressing conflicts of populism or bureaucracy or ability to engage with each other. So changing the way it addresses things is what I wish the EU would do.
Klaudia?
I think I wish no more surprises. I think EU, it's facing a lot of issues currently which need to deal with, and any more fuck ups, any more issues like the pandemic which happening now, it's just make the situation harder to back on the right track and prove to people the efficiency and the trust in the institution. So I think besides what Lucy said, to not repeat, I think this is something which for the next, I just wish the predictable next 2 or 3 years, that you can fill your plan and people feel like this is something constant, and deal with the refugees crisis with a lot of the rhetoric, and then being prepared and being stronger when the new issues came up in the future. Yeah.
Lovro?
So yeah, I wish EU that it doesn't become decadent and irrelevant in international relations, which I think there's a big possibility of happening, that it solves the economic problems that it has with kind of like sluggish growth, which I think is a priority, and that ultimately I think it enables to like I talked some things today about why I think UK leaving is bad for EU, but I think there's some also benefits because there are a lot of things which can happen a lot sooner and faster now in agreement. So I think that some of the policies in terms of foreign policy or security policy, where I understand that the country's identities are the most important and that people feel strongly about this, but also we're just like losing influence everywhere. If you look at UK or France or Germany as individual countries, or Spain are losing influence, I think that we can do a lot more like together here. I think just one maybe debate example was when the Iran deal was kind of like forged. It wouldn't be without EU. That's the deal would be forged actually, and the negotiations done by EU. So I think this is a good example where even if you have strong muscles such as US, or if you have like the covert ex-Soviet muscles such as Russia, you still or China as an emerging power, you're still unable to have this sort of diplomacy and good negotiation that EU had in this case. That brought about a deal that I think stopped a lot of the problems happening with the Iranian nuclear problem. Although it's like fallen apart now, but that's I think for different purposes. Yeah, so this would be my wish.
Lena?
So also trying to not repeat too much. I wish the EU like continues to exist and continues to do more good than harm. Hopefully also being able to do that on a like individual level, that like each country and hopefully each citizen can like feel that on balance the EU has been good for them. I also wish that the EU finds that common vision for the future of what exactly it wants to be, because I think a lot of the like problems are also that it's not necessarily clear within the EU or between different blocks, like of what exactly it should be doing moving forward, what the priorities should be, how institutions should be reformed, or whether they're fine the way they are. And I hope these issues do get resolved for like the EU to be able to be like not only like kind of good, but just a positive force for the continent.
So thank you very much for that. And I know that there have been questions from the audience, so I think we will now give the floor to a couple of those. So if you have a question and you are in this conversation, I guess raise your hand so that we can give you the floor. Is there anyone? Gitai.
Hi. So some of you have discussed that the European Union is declining and a bit failing, as Lucy said, right now because of the bureaucratic problems it has. And my question is that should the countries give more power to it to stop it from failing, or should it lessen and close down basically like each country will steer its way more and go and care for its interests the best it wants to?
Lucy.
I think to achieve the majority of things we talked about, the EU probably does have to at least agree on what powers it does have and doesn't have. It seems to have exceptions all over the place. And I also think, yeah, I would probably be in favor, not of complete control or like us becoming a European state, but a more agreed control of what the budgetary plans are and probably increasing the percentage of what countries have to give to it so that things can actually be achieved. I think part of the problem is paying too high a salary to people in Brussels and then also not having a clear buy-in and plan. I think the more money you give, the more you probably are buying in to an EU and to the outcomes of that EU. And it might be a better incentive to just give them that little bit more power to tip people into caring about it.
Klaudia, you also wanted to address this?
Just very briefly, it's just really hard for me to see like people leaving the idea of European Union and let EU fall, or like being less productive because of the connections already made, because of the current investment, because of the laws which were implemented and massive changes. So I think the only way is just go into this path and make maybe reforms, but there definitely need to be more repair system than like watching EU with falling, or like leaving the connections at some point.
Okay, do we have more questions? Lovro.
Quickly respond to this. I think a good example of this recently is how they handled the kind of like Corona economic crisis, where EU and leaders of countries, I guess, decided after like marathon negotiations, which were very tough because there were like countries that were more fiscally conservative than others, that they decided that the EU is now gonna get bonds of its own and loans of its own, and this is something which is going to finance the recovery. So basically, EU is going to give countries money, and then it's going to return the bonds at a later date. I mean, of course, this can't happen without it actually having the funds to do so, which can only come out of taxing the nation states or by further borrowing. I think this makes significant to some extent that countries are willing to a little bit put more things into EU, or at least more power in terms of these financial things. I think this is really crucial to maybe tie it back to the question, because a part of the problem, what happened in the EU was the crisis in 2008 and then the crisis in 2012. This caused a lot of rips in the coalitions, and a lot of countries fought against EU, and you still have kind of the consequences of this with, I don't know, Greece or potentially even Hungary being very tied to China and all of this, right? So I think this is a response that you get. And maybe just 30 seconds, EU is always in some sort of crisis, and there's always talks about it dissolving, dismantling, getting screwed. So I think that we can also talk about an inherent part of EU dealing with the crisis is this notion that it is an inherent crisis, which I think that then gives the urgency to people to actually agree, because it's oftentimes a unanimous way of agreeing things, which actually helps the union preserve. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but I'm to some extent convinced that this is true.
Okay. More questions? Gita, is that a new question?
Yeah, actually, I got another one if nobody else has. Who do you think might be next to join the EU?
Lucy?
Of the options, I think Serbia is more likely, but that's like based off the fact that Ireland is willing to accept Serbia, because we have a shit ton of Serbian workers in Ireland. So I think of the options on the table, I would see Serbia being accepted before the other ones. That's not to say I think they will be accepted quickly, though.
Does anyone want to add to that? Lovro.
I think Montenegro might actually join in at the same time as Serbia, or possibly even sooner, because of the relation with NATO, and they're further down the path of kind of like doing the negotiations. But I think 2020s is optimistic, at least early 2020s, 2027 maybe, that the soonest that any of them will join.
Okay. More questions?
If you want, I have a follow-up, but it's pretty. Let's give Shunya the.
So go for it. And that would be our last question.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I think that the EU and European states seem to decrease in its power under the global politics, like not, for example, in the tactics of infection control of COVID-19, or the global interests focused the presidential election or the absence of the chairs or the absence of European states in the Nagorno in the Azeri and Armenian conflicts and so forth, and in the all kind of context, it should be welcome for EU states or not, and how it would be changed or not.
Lovro, do you want to answer? Or Lucy, I see that you have a...
I don't think I can answer all of it, but one thing I think it again comes down to individual European states very often can do things internationally. So like there are certain European states that do form part of, say, NATO and do involve themselves in international conflicts through NATO rather than the EU. And then there are like certain countries who do well in terms of, say, trials and medication and things. I think one of the problems is tying it back to the EU, which probably ties into the last question as well, is if the EU could become more of an actual bloc that is referred to in terms of our successes, it would help the EU's like stance globally. Whereas I think countries are still trying to be global powers themselves rather than focusing on the EU being a global power, which I actually think ASEAN has done quite well insofar as coalescing a lot of their successes as an ASEAN success rather than individual members' successes, which I think the EU is still poor at doing.
Anyone else from the panel wants to add to that? Lovro.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I think that recently, actually, EU has a lot of problems that the environment in which it is very hostile. Not maybe hostile in terms of open conflict, but if you look at the UK, I mean, obviously the relations are really dire at this point because of the negotiations and Brexit and everything. Then you have Russia in the east, where you still have sanctions and since the Crimea and all of these things, and there's constant talks of this getting even worse because of Navalny and all of this stuff. And then in kind of like the Middle East or the beginning of the Middle East, you have Turkey, with which relations are really bad in terms of, this is, I think, the root of why Europe has no sway in terms of Armenian conflict, Azeri-Armenian conflict, because Turkey and Russia are playing a big role there, and EU cannot afford to piss Turkey because of the like couple of million of refugees that are still in Turkey, and that Erdogan is just waiting to weaponize and kind of create havoc in Europe, in EU, which he knows that EU is not going to be able to handle because how it mishandled very badly the last refugee crisis. So I think if this is the IR characterization, I think EU is pretty much screwed to some extent because it has no friends in the immediate surroundings, except maybe, I don't know how the relations are with Israel, but I think they're pretty good. And with the North African countries, I think there are good relations, at least if we exclude Libya and the immigrants here. I think it's crucial for EU to be very good friends with Biden. This is what EU has to do, because otherwise there are no friends that are near. There are maybe friends in I don't know, far away across seas, but not here. So this would be the solution, I think. The very best option, not necessarily also the solution.
Klaudia or Lena, do you want to add to that?
I think I want to add like a bit of a counter frame possibly. Like I think that while like all of this is like bad for the EU outward, I don't think it's necessarily bad for like internal cooperation. I think like some of the things also with Brexit ironically have just shown how important the EU is and how important it is for its member states, like both ensuring that it's just logistically incredibly difficult to leave, but also just ensuring that like it doesn't really get better. And with like the world outside becoming more hostile, I think to some extent that also shows to like countries and its citizens that it's important to have this internal bloc and to have good relations and to try to stand together. And I think at its best, this can also be a situation that drives the EU to work on its problems and to accept more integration and more power transfer to the EU just out of necessity, but also out of having highlighted that this is probably the only way.
Okay, Klaudia?
Just one thing. I think the reason why EU also lost some of the importance on the international area is because the new players pop out in terms of like the competition. So when ASEAN goes stronger, or like the other leaders goes more aggressive and like created some more competitive advantage towards the others. This is not necessarily that EU made some kind of failures on the arena, but also like the competition come harder. So I think it's both partially, but not only the EU internal structures issue. So I think there is like mixed factors which gave some of the weight to this. So that will be just my addition.
Okay, so I guess we won't take a lot more of your time, and I really, really want to thank everyone who is listening, but I really also want to thank everyone who spoke on this panel. I think it was fascinating, at least for me, and I've learned, and I'm sure that the debating community is going to utilize this, and it's a really important step in order to make more nuanced cases and to speak about things that are more realistic rather than assertions or things that you just read in an article and don't necessarily understand. So really, thank you very, very much.
Speakers, please don't do the "I heard you say this in a talk once" as analysis though, because that's really bad.
So try to present this as an actual fact or present this as something which is a probability.
Thank you, everyone. It was really great for me, and I'm getting used to these things where I'm the only guy on the panel, and it's awesome. More things should be like this.
Yay, change!
Progress.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for your invitation, Eyal, Monica, Israeli League. It was fun.
Yeah, so thank you guys as well.
So yeah, thanks so much for having me, and like also thanks so much to like the other three speakers. I think I also learned a lot from like other perspectives, and we'll see how much of that goes into my own debate cases. Thank you.
Yeah, I need to go now because I have a meeting, but I guess I will see you during this weekend at some point at some competition. So see you soon.
See you.
Same. See you guys. Visit Croatia. It's very nice.
Amen.